So mahalo for joining us. This is part 2 of our agroforestry workshop in the series brought to you by University of Hawai'i Hilo and the Marine and Environmental Research Institute of the Pacific and Hawaii Farmers Union United. So funding for this workshop series has been provided by the USDA Beginning Farmers and Ranchers Program and the Socially Disadvantaged Farmers and Ranchers Program. So my name is Darlene Kaya Maderis. I'll be your moderator for the series. I'm the executive assistant for Hawaii Farmers Union. We represent 16 regional chapters of family farms across 6 Hawaiian islands, each being supported through the Farmers Union through legislation, lobbying, and educational outreach. If you are interested in learning more about the Farmers Union, you can check out our website at hfuu.org. Also, you can learn more about membership, legislation efforts, our Farm Apprentice Mentorship Program if you're looking to further your education. We will also be continuing to share updated information on the free workshop series that you folks have joined us today for. You can find all of the previous recordings for these workshops as well as upcoming workshops in our YouTube channel, as well as the Google folder we'll be sharing in the chat. So we appreciate you joining us tonight. If you'd like to receive any future info on workshops directly, make sure you introduce yourself in the chat, include your information, email, where you're from, what you do. You can send that directly to myself or Maria Paz of UH, and we'll be able to get that information taken care of so that you can get that information directly. We also will have a poll following the end of the presentation. We'll be collecting that information along with some other information that's really important for us to be allowed to continue to provide programs such as these. If you do have any questions during the presentation, please make sure you put them in the chat and we'll have time to go over questions following the presentation. So due to some connection issues we've had in previous workshops, we'll be asking everybody to keep their videos off during the presentation. Our presenter will also be keeping their videos off. And this is just the hopes that we can reduce any technical issues. So without any further ado, our presenter tonight is Dave Sansone. He is the owner of Hawaii Edible Landscaping with over 20 years of experience creating bountiful and beautiful gardens, landscapes, farms, and forests. He'll be sharing some of that knowledge with us over the next workshop. And he's given us a lot to think of since part 1. So I'm sure everyone is excited to hear more about this in part 2. So I'd like to introduce you to Dave.
Okay, well, thank you, Darlene. Yes, my name is Dave Sansone. I am originally from the forested hillsides of Northwest New Jersey, and I've been in Hawaii since 2010, beginning of 2011. I own what was Agroforestry Design is now Hawaii Edible Landscape. So I offer landscaping, agriculture, agroforestry, conservation, and permaculture consultation, design, installation, maintenance, and education. So a wide range of horticultural services. And yeah, tonight let me get my screen up here for you so that we can all get to our video. Okay, and I will be hopping off in just a second here with my video. So yeah, welcome everybody. I appreciate everyone taking their time to come out and check this out. Okay, I'm just trying to get to my first page. There we are. And tonight's class is Intro to Agroforestry 2. 2 weeks ago, we discussed the origins of agroforestry and a number of examples. And then tonight we will be discussing the agroforestry principles and practices and many examples within that as well. There will be more classes coming up in the future, in-person classes. So if you're interested in that, please fill out the poll at the end of the workshop that we have tonight. When you leave the Zoom, it'll pop up. And this really helps us to know how we're doing. This goes back to the people who provide funding for us to provide these services for free. So it really helps us out if you could fill out that poll. So for those of you who couldn't make it last time, some of you who have never been exposed to agroforestry, you might be asking, what is agroforestry? Okay, let me get my video off here. And agroforestry is the integration of agriculture and forestry species and practices for ecosystem goods and services. In summary, it's working with plants, variety of plants. That's called a polyculture. On the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a list of characteristics. So polyculture is multiple species, plants or animals, or even fungi living together in the same area. They are productive, diverse, a diversity of crops, multi-use, and this is much more often with traditional agroforestry. There's more of a focus on multi-use, having many uses for the different plants. So it wasn't just like you had one crop for each function. And agroforestry has historically been shown to be resilient, reliable, and sustainable. Traditionally, it was also equitable. This was seen in many native cultures where there's a saying that people have described it as nobody went hungry unless everybody did, where food distribution was taken care of so that everybody's needs were met, to the point where quite a few of the nations across North America, there's stories about them basically where the chief and everybody else, you could walk into the chief's house, just lift up the flap in the teepee, walk right in and help yourself to food. And it was a way of maintaining a communal sense and responsibility. So there definitely was, equitability was a very important thing traditionally. In agroforestry, you get a variety of products and ecosystem services. So the goods that we get are a result from the ecosystem services. And the services are what nature does to improve the soil, protect the soil, fertilize, provide climate moderation. There's many benefits to ecosystem services. And if you're interested in this, check out the first class. So there's a spectrum of agroforestry practices that if we look on the left here, traditional agroforestry, and then on the right would be Western, and I termed it global South agroforestry. It's kind of like a variation of Western agroforestry, but we have kind of extremes there, where traditional is much more focused on sustainability and reliability, a diversity of crops, not so much for profit, family oriented, and there'd be community benefits. And then on the far right, we have the global South agroforestry, where it's a semi-simplified polyculture. So that would be 3 to 10, maybe 20 species within an area for a variety of ecosystem services, where there's a scarcity of things like fossil fuels, affordable machinery. Those are the two big things. And so if you don't have those resources that people use in the more wealthy areas, then nature can do the work for you. And so just over the last 80, really more like 60 years or so, there's been an incredible amount of work done around the world in the global South, where people have developed systems that meet the people's needs and also take care of the nature. And then we have our Western agroforestry, where that's a very simplified polyculture. So it would be like a tree and grains, or trees and animals below and pasture. So very simple, which allows for easy maintenance and also higher production, in a sense, of one crop or maybe two crops. There's a variety of ecosystem services, which we'll look at in a bit. Diversified income, and diversified crops. And for both of these, I say increased production and profits, question mark, because it's a relatively new method that's being used now. It's, you know, an ancient practice, but it's been adopted and there's still a learning curve. It's still not common knowledge like it used to be. And especially in the like here in Hawaii, we have incredibly increasing the cost of resources. Like the cost of diesel fuel has almost quadrupled in 20 years. You know, the cost of fertilizer, cost of everything has gone up. So we're facing all these different issues. And if we have machine focused agroforestry, we are dependent, and also we see increasing costs. And then in between those two ends of the scale, we have permaculture, which is more or less a Western take on traditional agroforestry, where Bill Mollison in Australia, he studied many indigenous cultures and then came up with a summary of earth care, people care, and fair share as primary principles. And they do use agroforestry as well as a number of other sustainable agriculture systems. So it's more complex, can be for money, but it's also definitely a bit more, you know, thinking more about taking care of the earth. Let's look at agroforestry principles and concepts. Whenever we do agroforestry, it's very important, especially here in Hawaii, to grow site-adapted plants. And you think about a cactus, you know, like most people think, oh, a cactus, it loves it wet, right? Or sorry, I'm testing you, loves it dry. Some dragon fruits, they like it wet, but you got to know which cactus you have, because if you grow the wrong cactus in the wrong place, it's not going to really do well, right? So here we have a chestnut growing at 5,000 feet here on Hawaii Island, adapted to low chill hours or chilling hours, and it's generally hours below 45 degrees Fahrenheit. If you grew bananas up there, they're not going to produce. So you really want to have a plant that's adapted to the climate, the water regime, the soil pH, that's very important, the fertility level, the drainage, the landform. You know, you don't want to grow vegetables on a steep hillside. You want to grow perennial plants, bushes, and deep-rooted plants. And to really get an understanding of plants, look at their historical or their ancient plant communities, what they're adapted to. So chestnut historically was grown in similar areas as raspberries, and it grew in similar conditions and grew with a number of other plants, such as perennial carrot type of relatives or plants. Polyculture is, as I said before, multiple species raised in one area, and overyield is a benefit that you can get for a well-designed polyculture, where you produce more per acre with a polyculture than you would if you grew each separate crop on its own land. So the famous Three Sisters, which was practiced not everywhere across North America and Central America, but in many places, of corn, bean, and squash, was put through a study where they figured out that they were able to produce more corn in the polyculture than corn grown in a monoculture. So that means literally it was able to produce more corn than you could in just a single field with just corn. Plus, there's the benefits of the squash and the beans, which had a reduced yield, but overall that 1 acre over yielded 1.7 acres of monocrop. This is a big deal when you think about hunger and sustainability, because it's producing more food, but then we have these ecosystem services where we have significant reduction in weeds. We have more nitrogen in the soil after harvest than when we started, because the beans are nitrogen fixing plants, which they hold on to that nitrogen very firmly unless there's a big rain. That's one thing I've noticed. If you have a lot of rain, plants around nitrogen fixing plants will green up a bit. But usually they release it when they lose leaves and when they die. And therefore there's more nitrogen in the soil than when you started. Agroforestry often will focus on regenerative systems, and that's more of a trait of permaculture and global south systems, where what we see here, this is a mulch bank. It's also a privacy barrier. And the grass is lemongrass. That's a weed barrier grown densely to stop running weeds. The grass is cut for mulch. It's cut and carried and used as an excellent long-lasting mulch. And the bush is pigeon pea, which we can use either a chainsaw or loppers or a hedge trimmer to top and then use that as mulch as well. They're both food. Lemongrass is medicine, and they offer ecosystem services. So as you can see, they offer a variety of uses, and they each have their own purposes. And they grow back after you cut them. I encourage people to mimic nature, because nature is, we live in nature, we're part of nature, and this is, nature wants to do what nature does. And then we've been so accustomed to thinking this is how we grow food. We kill everything in sight and then plant our one thing. And that's gotten us in a bind where we have a mass extinction as a result. So when we mimic nature, we can work with nature and let nature do the work. And nature works in polyculture, multiple species, succession. That's what happens when you have a clearing and vegetation just starts growing back and it turns into a forest over time. Or in some areas, it might be like a prairie. There's overstory and understory. The overstory in the picture is a koa tree, nice tall tree. And then the understory is a kala. It's a Hawaiian rubus, which is related to raspberry. And then off in the distance is chestnut. So look at that. Historically, chestnut and raspberries grew near each other. And now here in Hawaii, even though that chestnut's not native, it seems to be working well with this native plant. Nature also has plants and animals. It usually doesn't, bar animals unless it's a really steep slope. So, then the birds fly in. Nature is constantly moving around. Animals live and die, and they fertilize wherever they go. So if we block off nature, then we're losing free fertility. Nature also improves itself, builds soil. It's resilient, reliable, and sustainable. And for all people who are interested in agroforestry, I've met quite a few people and I've done many consultations where folks dove in and then the wave kind of caught up to them. They kind of rushed in and they didn't wait for it. And then the wave just tossed them, where the weeds take off, the pests come in, and it can become a money pit with incredible amounts of labor for decreasing benefits. So I encourage people to start small with this. This is what Masanobu Fukuoka told a permaculture teacher of mine. He said, start small, learn from your mistakes, and build on your successes. Because when we work with these diverse systems, it's complex, it takes time, and yeah, you're better off just going a little bit slow. And then as you gain experience, scale up from there. Let's look at agroforestry practices. These are the practices recognized by the USDA. They offer a variety of incentives and resources for people to practice these sustainable farming and conservation practices. So we have our agroforestry farming practices, including silvopasture, alley cropping, forest farming, urban food forests, and then our linear agroforestry practices, windbreaks, riparian forest buffers, and I added this last one, vegetative filter strips, which is, it's not one of the primary agroforestry practices, but they do have conservation programs that do support that. And here's a long list of programs that people can check out if you're interested in trying to find some help. They have financial incentives, loans, insurance, processing and sales assistance, conservation, and other programs as well. And I have the website posted here. I'll just give you a minute if you want to, you know what I'll do? I will just, I can't copy that. So yeah, it's just right there. It's the USDA, and there's tons of resources, lots of great educational materials, and the people who work there are really nice. They're pretty busy, so just, you know, be kind and patient because there's a lot of folks who are interested in this. Silvopasture. That is silvo, meaning tree. That's the root word of tree is silva. That's where it comes from. And so silvopasture. So you have our trees and then our pasture. And the pasture has animals of some sort. These are macadamia nuts with cows below. And this orchard is kind of on its transition out. We have a lot of macadamia nut that's starting to transition out. It's getting older. They're getting beat up. They're just having root disease. So we see dieback in a lot of macadamia nuts. So running cows below them is a way to keep the grass down. And, you know, you have grazing. That is hilo grass that we see there, and it's a rather low quality forage. So that's kind of a sign of it wasn't an intentional pasture that was planted, but more a planting that was just put in without improved pasture. So we can do that. We can improve pasture. We can do all kinds of things. Harvesting the macadamia nut is kind of tough when you have grass down. That's why most people use, well, production uses herbicide. They like bare soil to make it so that they can easily pick up the nuts. I work with organic processes. So things like, what's that? Go-to cola, if you want to, you know, harvest the nut is one way. It's a very low growing plant, but basically what happens is we have our primary crop. And sometimes if we have our two crops, primary and secondary, there's an interaction between them that might not be so good. And we'll get into that in a little bit. Another type of silvopasture is just running a horse in an orchard where the horses, they tend not to eat too much of the woody plants. They prefer grasses. They might lean up against something or, you know, rub against a tree maybe. But this is a great system where this barely needs any mowing. Just an occasional mowing or weed whacking would help to limit the weeds that the horse does not eat from becoming the predominant ground cover. That's a very important thing in pasture management. You want to make sure whatever those animals eat doesn't take over, or whatever they do not eat, make sure that that does not take over. The animal manure and urine feeds these trees, which then keeps that fertility out of the waterways. So it's a little bit more of a closed loop system. If we fly all the way over to the Iberian Peninsula in Spain, there's a Dehesa agroforestry system. It's reported to be about 2,000 years old. And it's a native pig that is raised below oak trees. And it is grazed. It's a low density grazing because it's a rather arid location, but they produce one of the most expensive porks on earth, where this one of these products here, it's selling for over $200 a pound. For those of us without as much money, $44 for a pork chop. Well, I guess actually that's a little bit out of my budget, but as you can see, this is a specialty crop, and many specialty crops come from agroforestry systems because it takes time to develop the agroforest, to grow an oak tree, to grow the shade for a shade loving or a shade tolerant crop. So there is an economic potential for people to do agroforestry, and then also the environmental benefit of having trees in the landscape. With it being 2,000 years old, it's right at about the same time that Rome colonized Iberian Gaul. This was around the time of Julius Caesar. And it kind of would make sense that this would be a Roman practice. Much of the ancient world had agroforestry. They didn't have machines. So it's actually an ecosystem now because it's such a broad area. There's a lot of benefits. Obviously, it's sustainable. It's gone on for 2,000 years. But there's also the downside of when we have an extremely high value product, it's for export. And that's the reason why Rome colonized Gaul, was to then have the exports to send back to Rome. So it's almost like what we have here in Hawaii, where was it about 80% of the food we grow here is shipped off. Almost like Ireland, where much of the food was shipped off during the Great Famine over there, where there's more than enough food that was being grown when millions of people were dying of starvation, but it was being shipped off the island by settlers back to England. So this is one thing I really want to encourage people to think about, is to think about the equitability part, think about the community part. If you can find a way to diversify and have a variety of crops, including, I'm not going to say we shouldn't ship anything off. Who am I to say what anyone should do, but perhaps having a diversity where you have some things like there's $15,000 watermelons, and there's like just crazy expensive things, and you just need to sell a little bit. So a small amount for export, and then crops like ulu for local production is a way to diversify and close your loop, have additional products, but also have, help feed the people here on the island. Looking at alley cropping. Alleys are a row of tree or shrubs. And then we have actually I take it back. The row is the row of tree or shrubs, and then the alley is the crop in the middle. So we have the taro, that's the alley. And then on the right there, we have the hedge row. That's a densely planted row of pigeon pea there. And the hedgerow alley cropping offers a wide array of benefits, including erosion control, where we're stopping nutrients from leaving and soil from leaving. And then when we chop and drop the mulch, we trap sediments that are coming down the hill. So now we're actually building, and then the deep-rooted plants are tilling the soil, and the nitrogen-fixing plants are fertilizing. We're adding mulch. We have diversified crops. So we have all these different benefits just from hedgerow alley cropping. And one of the big ones for us here is weed control. Weeds are one of our biggest challenges wherever we go, unless you have extreme drought. Things just want to grow here. So we need a variety of practices to naturally beat the weeds and make it so that they don't even have a chance to grow, and we're not stuck having to tend them. Alley cropping with trees, and this would be a standard tree in the sense of these trees have gaps between them. They're could be fruit trees or nut trees, while the hedge rows are dense lines of trees or shrubs. The alley in the middle can be something like produce, could be ava is another one. But what you notice here is that the vegetation of the trees is not overhead on top of the other alley crop. So it's a mixture of sun and shade. And this is kind of like that Dehesa system where they had widely spaced trees, and then between it would be pasture. Here's another hedgerow alley cropping. This is at the Kohala Center's demonstration farm that I planted. And this is ava, our primary crop that we see in the foreground. There's papayas, there's kalo, which you can't see, and it's coming out of the cover crop. There's a ground cover. There's a diverse cover crop. There's a vetiver hedgerow in the back. That's a type of hedgerow. The vetiver, that's a filter strip. It's a row of grass that's a specific kind of grass that is used to trap nutrients and sediments. And then in the background, we have the Gliricidia, or Madre de Cacao. I encourage people to use caution with that tree because it can get quite large and it can become a lot of work. If you have a lot of it in the landscape, that means you'll be doing quite a bit of chainsaw work. While pigeon pea, it's really easy to kill. You can break it with your hands. You can push it over. So a lot easier to maintain that one. There's a hedgerow alley cropping system called Inga hedgerow alley cropping, developed in Central America. The ice cream bean, as we call it here, is a native tree where this system was developed. It's nitrogen fixing, and the leaves have a very high lignin count. And if you look at the alley here, we have pineapples, and the pineapples are mulched with those Inga or ice cream bean leaves. They last a very long time, so they make an excellent mulch. The downside is that this tree can get very large quickly. It also makes many seeds. They're very large seeds that are pretty perishable, so it's not invasive where it's spreading all over the place. Usually the smaller small hard seeds, those are the ones that are prone to being invasive, but this one can be weedy where it can pop up right below the trees that are growing. So in a way, it's almost like kukui, but a little bit more aggressive than kukui. But it's an amazing nitrogen fixing plant. Has so many benefits. So it's one to use with caution if you are going to go down that road. I'll just tell you that. It's called a machete tree in Central America. Machete farmers use that tree. And one last hedgerow alley cropping system is the sloping agricultural land technology, SALT. And what it is it's a dense row of shrubs, woody shrubs that are grown together to form what becomes a bioterrace, in the sense that it's a vegetative strip filter or filter strip. Soil, when it rains, gets caught up in there, and then it builds up and turns into a type of terrace. So it's a hedge, it's a row, and then it's also making mulch. It can be nitrogen fixing. And what we see here is that the non-salt trial, they did a study where one system had the hedgerows, one did not. The one without the hedgerows lost 57 times more tons per hectare per year of soil than the one with the hedgerows. So can you see how in these systems, when we conserve we're building up resources, this natural fertility that we're letting run away. So this is another way in which we can increase our production and our sustainability is just trapping the nutrients coming through the landscape. And when you live on a mountainside, they can be quite a lot. Let's transition into forest farming, because this system at Kanakakawa was an alley cropping system. And it was also a hedge system. So there's trees, and then some were cut, some were not. So and then those trees became overstory trees over time. So that's where you can see there's this, these are specific practices, but nature is, you can't really delineate it, right? You can say this or that, but it's like nature is a spectrum of things. And that's what this illustrates, that these systems can morph over time. When we have an overstory, the trees above, and an understory in the shade with dappled or part sun, then that would be forest farming or multi-story agroforestry. And there's a variety of things that you can grow in these conditions. Many of them are quite pricey. Non-timber forest products, NTFPs, there's many of those, and mushrooms would be one example. Ava is another. And then there's also the timber from above. When the trees get big enough, then those can be milled up. And once again, we have a range of ecosystem services from this relationship of plants. Forest farming, once again, we have our secondary crop. This is our overstory crop is our secondary crop, and then the primary crop is the understory, and that is cacao. Cacao does not really like full sun. It can handle it if it has a lot of nitrogen, but then it's prone to polluting the water. If you dump lots of nitrogen on the ground, it ends up somewhere, and a lot of it either goes in the atmosphere or in the water. So we have our shade crop, which has a variety of uses. Coconut, the tree of 1,000 uses. But this whole system was developed for primarily as a chicken food forest. And then the secondary, the second primary crop was cacao. So we have 2 primary crops and then a whole bunch of other secondary crops, which then also provide ecosystem services like forage and fodder. So forage is plants that animals will gather, and fodder is what you carry to them. Provide shelter, fertility, and then those plants absorb the nutrients that the animals, the chickens, poop all over the place in the chicken food forest. We have a variety of foods. So this is more of a farmstead model where there's higher diversity and it feeds people on a homestead, but there's also some products for sale. This is a young forest farm or multi-story agroforestry system. We have an ulu tree and our kalo. There's mustard greens on the ground. That was part of the ground cover. There's edible perennial greens like sisu spinach. That's an evergreen ground cover. And then we have pigeon pea. The pigeon pea is, at this point, the overstory plant. It's providing shade and also occasionally for mulch, which you see at the base of that ulu. Urban food forestry. This is a relatively new one on the USDA list. It's also called edible landscaping. And food is at a premium and land is at a premium in urban areas. So you can really pack in food in a tight space. This is a privacy barrier that was densely planted. There's all kinds of plants you cannot even see yet. There's all kinds of palms right now. You cannot even see the fence anymore. It's grown so thick. That's crown flower right next to the sealing wax palm. That's used in making lei. There's a perennial red bell pepper. There's figs, African blue basil, papayas, kalo was grown there, perennial greens, native plants, flowers, bee habitat. Yeah, you name it. It's medicine. There's so many different things packed into this this planting, including an endangered species, the iliahi, the Hawaiian sandalwood, which needs to grow with another plant. It's hemiparasitic. It doesn't really want to grow by itself. It needs something else to get its roots latched onto. So that is thriving in these conditions, with these part shade conditions, which trees are adapted to. They're not adapted to growing in these open fields. They're used to popping up in a forest or on the edge of a forest, coming through the shade to get to the light. So the plants are very happy in this little planting. We also have a very good nutrient utilization, where if you throw fertilizer down, a lot of it's going to get used because there's so many plants. If you have a monoculture, we lose a lot, and then also the grass will eat up a lot as well. We have a privacy barrier on the right, where this is, what is that? Rollinia. That's a Rollinia tree. That's a row of Rollinia. They're a high value custard fruit that grows. You can produce fruit within 3 years from direct planted seeds if you're at a low elevation. And we have our edible ground cover there. And then in the back, we have a comfrey weed barrier to stop weeds from running in. And we also grew palms and papayas, and it turned into a semi-dense planting to provide privacy. And then over on the left, this is almost like a hedgerow within that privacy barrier. We have bananas and tea leaf plants and palms and orchids and hapu'u and different plants. So you can pack a lot of food in and also make it quite beautiful. Okay, jumping into the linear agroforestry practices. We see a line of windbreak trees. You might notice plantings like this. If you live on Hawai'i Island, there's quite a few of them where it's just a row of trees, often along a road. Evergreen trees like this, which are ironwood. This is the ironwood that does not send root suckers. There's one that sends root suckers that's invasive and will just dominate your field. So if anybody's thinking about planting ironwood, make sure you have the right species, or else you could be creating a lifetime of work. This is a very windy location, so this was a double row of trees. And inside we have macadamia nuts. You'll notice there's no vegetation below the ironwood. And that's one of the reasons why we see it here in this, this windbreak, because it suppresses weed growth. It's amazing like that. So does eucalyptus in certain species, and podocarpus. All three of those species have long limbs that are very flexible. Eucalyptus is, it's pretty flexible. Sometimes it can be brittle, but they form an amazing windbreak. They reach out into the wind, and when the wind comes, it buffers it so that by the time it goes through, it's diffuse. This image illustrates what, in many places, this is what's encouraged, where people do multiple species, multiple rows of vegetation increasing in height, which takes up a lot of space. When I first came to Hawaii, I was kind of surprised to see these single row windbreaks. But after experience with them and observing them long enough, I realized, wow, that's pretty smart, because they make the windbreak tighter. It allows more room for cropping area, and they selected the right trees to then absorb the wind without having to have multiple rows of this gradient of vegetation. One of the keys is that you don't want them to be too dense. If you're too dense, then the wind is going to go right up over it and then come down straight on your crop. That's not good. A key for designing these systems is that you have a wind reduction distance equal to 10 times the windbreak height. So if I had a pigeon pea that was 6 feet tall, I would get a windbreak of 60 feet, more or less. If you go up on the mountain, it's very windy up here, open. This has been deforested and animals are running on it. We have lots of cows up there. The cattle were wild for a while. And so now we have these large windbreaks. And I couldn't really get the arrow to make it look like it, but basically what you want to do is have your windbreak perpendicular to your troublesome winds. So your prevailing winds, and then also for us, our Kona winds. Those are the very damaging winds that push the trees the opposite direction and tend to push trees over. And it's best to have multiple windbreaks for whole field protection. Animals love shelter. You'll see them hiding out there in the heat of the day. There's all kinds of habitat there. There's so many benefits of a windbreak. It's one of the simplest things that people can do for, if you have a larger piece of land that you're managing. And the benefits are really, they affect people downwind from you. Looking at the riparian forest buffer, riparian meaning waterways or along the waterway. And it's just vegetation to trap nutrients and sediments to protect the water. We have a variety of species. The closer you get to the water, it's going to be ideally more native plants and less managed. And then as you go further from the water, you can do like fruits or other crops that aren't requiring you to dig in the soil. And you can do medicines. There's lots of possibilities. But the main thing is that this vegetation absorbs the nutrients and traps the sediments so that we don't have erosion into the waterways. This is a riparian forest buffer that I planted at Huleke Farm, just outside of a chicken forage system that we saw a little while ago. And so we see there's no chickens below. They're not, around all this tree. The tree is absorbing the nutrients from those chickens. To the right, there's more vegetation going down to a creek. So once again, we're turning a problem, these nutrients that when they get in the water, they're a problem. Now it's a solution where those nutrients are then feeding a crop right there. A program I was involved with in Washington, the USDA CREP program, Conservation and Resource Enhancement Program, was doing riparian forest buffers along salmon waterways, creeks and rivers, where we planted all kinds of native trees. Here you can see the tree tubes or tree shelters. And then in the distance, we see the reforestation going on. This is a place that's very prone to flooding and mass erosion. So there's lots of different methods. There's many examples. And for all this stuff that we're looking at, I highly encourage people to check out the many resources. We have a Google Drive page that has an introduction to agroforestry document that I created, and then a number of other resources. One of the main ones I encourage people to look at is agroforestry.org, based here on Hawaii Island, started and run by Craig Elovich. And it's one of the best agroforestry resources you can find, where there's free ebooks of all kinds of stuff that it's really high level education. So do your homework, check that out, and you're going to learn so much. Okay, so the last agroforestry practice I'm going to look at today is the vegetative strip filter. And I want to share this because this can be applied on farms. This can be applied below a business, this like industry. This is on a sea cliff here in this image. This is the vetiver grass, that's an erosion control grass, cliff stabilization grass. And the key to this is planting them densely so that when the water is moving across the landscape during high rainfall, it slows down moving through that grass and then sinks and settles out and then becomes part of a bioterrace. You can use things like lemongrass around your garden. And the benefit is it's also a mulch bank. It's a nutrient trap. It is it's functional. It has roots that you can use. So there's multitude of benefits. And then here we have papayas, and there's native plants. So there's a lot of different ways that you can integrate all these different practices together to compound the benefits. So when we start small, we learn from our mistakes and we build on our successes, then we can really cash in and see the good economic and the ecological benefits. Okay, well, I'm going to stop there. Okay, I think it's time for questions.
Well,
Yeah.
mahalo so much for that, Dave. That was super impressive. I'm sure there is so much information that people are furiously taking notes on. But as we've put in the chat, you can check out all of these recordings in the Google Drive or our YouTube channel. Feel free to view them as much as you want. So I have also put up our poll. If you folks can fill that out, we would greatly appreciate that. That helps us to continue these types of workshops and be able to provide these resources to you folks. So I do have a bunch of questions in the chat already. So let's go and get into that.
Okay.
All right. So our first question comes as, is 3 acres enough room for an ulu agroforest? Sorry, Dave, did you hear me?
No, I couldn't hear you.
Oh, Kalamai. Okay, so the first question is 3 acres enough for an ulu agroforest?
Sure, definitely. Yeah, 3 acres is plenty of ground. The diversity level that you work with is, you have different options. Generally speaking, if you're going to do agroforestry like ulus for production and sales, then it's important to keep your diversity simplified so that you're not having to work with lots of different plants. But you can also have things like your vegetative filter strips on the outside. You can have pollinator habitat on the outside. So you can still have other species in the area which offer other benefits, but focus on 3 to probably no more than 5 crops for sale from that Ulu agroforestry system. And one quick note, while the trees are young, they need to be caged. If you want to try silvopasture, you need to protect the trees from the animals, but that's a nice way in the short term to get a yield where you have animals grazing, and then it shifts over to animals below those fruit trees, which they fertilize and offer lots of benefits.
Okay, mahalo. All right, moving on, we have another question. Dehesa agroforestry looks appealing with the feral pigs. How does one protect young trees?
Well, I guess I kind of answered right there, but yeah, you need to protect your trees. If you have any animals in the landscape, when they're young, they either will want to eat them or rub up against them. So they need some kind of protection, which would be for pigs, the hog wire, or what I've seen also work is the hard panels, the fencing panels, the rigid wire. It's like a very thick gauge wire panels that can be cut and made into a square or even just bent around into a circle. One little note on that is that the weeds want to take off if you just stick that on pasture. It's kind of troublesome. So I encourage people to get the weeds out before you put those cages on, or else it's really difficult to do weed control.
Yeah, those methods are definitely helpful, even when dealing with some feral animals that you weren't trying to pasture.
Yeah.
So our next question is, how much soil loss do fields average from growing sweet potatoes here? Is sweet potato farming using the methods here in Hawaii sustainable?
I don't know the numbers offhand, what they're losing. I couldn't say. It is grown as an annual here. So in some places it's a perennial where you can even grow it as a ground cover, but the production will be lower where you're not sure where the roots will be. Here, it's definitely, often grown on slopes, and it does cause considerable erosion after harvest. And even just in the process, especially when we have heavy rains, that's when we really lose. I see them going back to the same spots. So it's a cycle. They have a 3-year fallow of guinea grass, and then they go back and do sweet potato again. So I don't really know the numbers on it. I prefer to use agroforestry myself, and I'm not a big fan of doing root crops on slopes. I think we could do better than that. Maybe if they had some vetiver barriers around their systems, it'd be a way to at least trap more of the nutrients leaving the system.
Okay, our next question. So the advice I have received concerning pets is to canoe plants far apart to prevent pests going from plant to plant. How does agroforestry address the issue of pests?
There's a lot of different ways to address pests, and I'm kind of at the other end of the spectrum where, if you look in a forest, the plants are all growing together, but the leaves aren't touching. It's a very strange thing, unless there's a bunch of weeds in there. And so that's a good agroforest can have high diversity or even moderate diversity, but the plants reach out and find their spot. What I do for pest control is diversity. So you don't just have one plant where the pest comes in and just wipes everything out. You can have ground covers. So if you have ants are a real problem here in Hawaii, right? Because they farm aphids and cause sooty mold as a result of those aphids on the plants. Mint, like the mint ground cover, is known to repel ants. And I have not done this yet. This is just something I'm trying to figure out. A client of mine has a sooty mold, and I figured out, okay, these are the ones that work for this. And this is a potential option. For rose beetles, I use the cranberry hibiscus. It's a pest trap crop, which the rose beetles seem to like to eat more. And then if you just cut that occasionally and compost or feed it to chickens, then it's a way for them to prey on something that they'd rather have instead of the things that you would rather have. But there's many ways to go, and it's a whole that we could do a whole class on that, on pest control and agroforestry. And in the last class, I kind of talked about one issue is perennial plants can see a buildup of pests instead of, like, you know, vegetables. You clear out the vegetables, those pests are gone. The perennials can build up, so there are some challenges with that as well.
Okay, so I have a comment more than a question. But it's talking about how sheep will eat the bark off of lots of trees, even when they have plenty of grasses and other plants to eat. I'm guessing there might be like a question here on how to manage that, possibly.
Yes, yes. So sheep, and what's interesting is sheep are not as bad as goats. Goats will destroy just about anything. And I think if the sheep are doing that, to me, that's more of an indicator of the pasture is not really ideal. Maybe it's a low quality forage. Just when I say low quality, it means low in protein. They would rather eat the grass, and you know, they'll do a little bit of grazing, but when they start eating bark, it's either for minerals or they're missing something. But that's why we have to put cages around things until the trees get established, and then also limb up your trees if you need to, so that the animals don't eat them.
Okay, mahalo for that. All right, so it looks like we are at the end of our questions that are in the chat. Do we have any questions from our audience that would like to ask any more questions directly to Dave?
Fire away.
Feel free to unmute yourself. Put them
Yeah,
in the
jump in.
chat, either way. Up to you.
I have a question.
Go for it.
We have restored an area that's got a lot of ohia. We've removed the guava, and after we've removed the guava, which is, as you know, allelopathic, we've got a lot of really wonderful broadleaf plants that are growing underneath it. Some of it are mamaki and the urticaceae.
Wow.
I don't know how to identify which is which and which to remove. Is there any way to expedite that, or some guide, or, you know,
Yeah.
I mean, there's even some what do they call it? Gunpowder tree in there that's among it. I just like to figure out which ones to kill and which one to save.
Sure. So there's many books, you know, I have a whole library of books, plant identification books. And nowadays we're lucky that we have all these different plant ID applications for smartphones. So there's one called Plant Net that I use that seems to work well, but there's Hawaiian plants are a little bit tougher to get the positive ID on. But many of the weeds, that's usually, you know, where you're going to find the weed trees and the different vegetation. So that's what I do if I don't know what it is. But that is one of the services I offer is a plant identification, because it's very important. Like, you know, you took out the invasive, and then what's coming back is some native and then some invasive. And it's important that we don't, you know, kill off the natives thinking that they might be invasive.
Bingo. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Glad to hear you doing that. Anybody else?
I was thinking about, dealing with pests,
Mhm.
and, the borders planted with neem, the neem tree,
Nice.
and like, so your prevailing winds would hit the neem border, or your pest could, and then build your ecosystems inside of that. I think that, like what I've seen before is that like whole nurseries can get turned around just by having a neem tree right out front.
Really?
Yeah,
Wow.
I've seen that in Baja.
That's good to hear. I did not know that. I know the oil is you know, an effective slow acting insecticide, non-toxic, but that's really good to know. But also just the barrier itself. Having a windbreak is a way to stop pests from seeing the crops, and also to make it so they don't blow in as much. But it seems like what you're saying is there's additional benefits like essential oils that are being released.
Yeah, and those oils or whatever it is attracting like beneficial insects and that kind of thing, and making it's enhancing your ecosystem there as far as the benefits that it does to the insect population as it goes through.
Wow. Well, thank you. That's a good tip.
Yeah, and I really think that the neem, like you say, you could like grind the nuts up and like make the oil as like a foliar thing on the there's a lot of different things like it just seems to incorporate the neem into your cropping system to avoid a pest problem is probably a pretty good idea. And one thing I was wondering, like, is there any place that you know of that you can get like a bunch of neem trees?
I don't know of anybody offhand. Maybe who is that? They're up in Kohala. Aikane Nursery.
Oh yeah.
I think they're focusing primarily on native plants now, but they have some permaculture plants. There's also, what is it, the Fruit Lover, or I think his name's Oscar. There's a gentleman in Puna who has a wide diversity of agroforestry and all kinds of trees and plants that he propagates.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe I would look it up on Craigslist or on Facebook. I bet you somebody's got it out there.
Yeah, it's probably not that hard to find what you want, right?
Yeah, I bet. Okay, I'm replying to the question, what is the name of the plant app? And it is plant.net. And I just am typing it in right now. There it is. Okay, any other questions?
It looks like we've got a couple more. So definitely about the neem seeds, we are getting more questions on that as well. But so the follow-up question to where to find neem seeds is we do identify that what comes in from seed bank, some gulches are mamaki forest now, but where there is no native seed bank, what can we plant that will grow quickly enough to shade out the weeds in 1 or 2 whipping cycles?
Oh, that's a pretty detailed question. Somebody's thinking about that. It all depends on the vegetation that you have. That's really the biggest issue. And when we have perennial weeds, perennials are plants that live with long lived. If you weed whip once, they're going to come right back. You'll kill the annuals, like the little herbaceous plants. So most of the weeds are going to keep on growing when you weed whip them. JB Friday, he's an extension agroforester for UH. He told me that Micronesians will plant how, there's a native tree how in a field of guinea grass. Cut down the grass, stick the how in, but it takes 5 years. And then it turns into a how forest, no more weeds. But yeah, I don't know of anything that's going to where you can just weed whip it and then plant something and then the weeds are going to be gone. Although I'll just say maybe one exception might be lab. It's a perennial bean that's a smothering. It can be invasive in a forest, so don't let it get into a forest, but in a field setting, you can use it as a cover crop and then it can climb up guinea grass and other grasses and then pull them down. But I think it would take quite a while before that might actually work. I've never done that, but that's the only thing I can think of that might actually like smother existing vegetation. If you need any clarification or any other thoughts on that, feel free to chime in.
Is that called stink miley?
No. Yeah. I'll never encourage anyone to plant that. No, it's just called lab. I'll type it in the message box here. LAB. Yeah, stink mile or mile pilau. Or mile
I-
pilau. Yeah, that is, I'm not sure the other name for that, but that is a horrible, horrible weed that you have to really do an amazing good job on weed control, pulling all the roots, or else it's just going to keep on coming back no matter what you do.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, I do have some more questions in the chat. So the next one is, I have an area that is prone to flooding in heavy rains. The soil is depleted and rocky. Do you have any suggestions on what I can plant? Thank you.
Okay, so luckily with agroforestry, we can grow in just about any conditions. You know, if there's water and it's not too cold, we can grow things. It's very common, the conditions you're describing here in Hawaii, that the soil has been degraded, you know, deforestation, bulldozers, long history of plantation agriculture, you know, export agriculture. There's just a long list of things where the soil has been degraded. In that situation, the key is, well, if you have a very shallow soil on, say, Pohoihoi, the hard lava rock, you need to be careful, because if you were to, you know, kill the weeds, if you did like weed mat or something, that the black woven weed mat, your soil was being held by those roots of the vegetation, and you get some heavy rainstorms, you could lose even way more of your soil. So you want to really protect the soil that's there. Bananas, you know, you can always build up mounds, do rock walls. That's a traditional Hawaiian planting method of these raised beds with rock walls, filled it with good soil. Yeah, bananas, coconuts, ulu, avocado, kalo, you could mound it. So really, yeah, you don't have a lot of soil resources. Yeah, I'll think a bit more about it, but that's just off the top of my head. I just think of like tree crops, and then near your house you can do raised beds where you improve the soil, and then you can still grow some produce, and then everywhere else you don't have to do nearly as much of soil improvement. So hopefully that helps.
Okay, mahalo. So we have another question. How long does it take for a tree to be established? There is no specification on what type of tree though.
Okay. Well, established to me would be, it doesn't need irrigation. You know, if we're having to irrigate a tree for the rest of its life, or else it's going to die, that's, to me, that's not an established tree, or it's just not a tree that's in the right location. So, but that's the main thing. It doesn't need irrigation. It's not going to easily fall over. That could take 6 months to a year to, you know, like established is in the sense of like, you know, it's a real tree. It could take a few years. So it all depends on the tree. Some are very slow growing, some are very rapid growing, but usually it's going to be about 2 years before it's going to seem like a real tree that's like in it for the long haul.
Okay, we're going back to neem for the next question. I haven't had luck growing neem. What's their preferred climate?
Oh boy, that's a good question. Let me look it up. Yeah,
There was
luckily I've got all,
another comment that said,
okay.
it grew really well in my childhood home in Nu'uanu on Oahu. If that's helpful. So I know Nu'uanu is a little bit kind of rainy. It tends to get a little more moisture. So that
Okay.
could be an indication.
Yeah, well, number one, I would say it's subtropical or tropical, right? It needs to be warmer. It's not going to be growing at a higher elevation. I've seen it growing out near Honoka'a, and that's monsoon season where it can go with many months of drought. But yeah, I generally think of it as like, you know, kind of like wetter locations. So probably under 1,000 feet should be fine in most of windward Hawaii and much of the leeward side where it's drier.
Right, well, I hope that helps answer those questions. It doesn't look like we've got any more questions. We do have some comments to some of the other questions in the chat that I'll just go ahead and read off real quick if anybody's not seeing what's in the chat. So pigeon pea grows fast and will shade out most weeds quickly. And then also a suggestion of checking plantpono.org before you plant a new plant.
Yeah.
And then also I've heard rumor that KNF IMO, Korean Natural Farming, indigenous microorganisms can break down rock into soil a few inches in a few years.
Wow. Wow. I haven't seen that. I think that might be a little bit bold of a claim. It does, especially if we have permaculture systems. I've built up soil like an inch per year just from chop and drop and perennial systems that trap nutrients. But yes, it does liberate fertility. Those microbes do liberate fertility in the soil and on decaying rocks. So we have actually a lot of iron in the blue rock that we have here on the island. So it's like, oh wait, I said iron, phosphorus, excuse me. It does have iron as well, but it has a lot of phosphorus. So those are minerals that are available when it breaks down. And then another quick note on fast growing plants to suppress weeds, cover crops. You know, if it's like a low growing weed, then there's all kinds of things like the crotallarias. I'll spell it out in the message box here. Crotallaria. There's oats, which is a type of cover crop. There's annual rye, which is a low growing cover crop, which is allelopathic, meaning that it's going to inhibit weed seed germination. And there's also many types of beans that you can, excuse me, that you can grow as well.
Okay, so we are gonna start wrapping up. I've got one more question or two more questions in the chat
Okay.
right now. Just a reminder for everyone, if you haven't had a chance to take the poll, please make sure you do get all that information in there. We can keep getting these workshops to you folks. So I'm gonna go ahead and get these next questions out. Are there common weeds in Hawaii that are beneficial as food building soil fertility?
Well, every plant has a use. Even that stink pilau, I bet, has a use. But there's a lot of weeds that are medicinal that many of them have been embraced by La'au Lapa'au practitioners, where the illnesses changed when European folks came. They brought diseases, but they also brought the weeds that were used for those illnesses. So there's all kinds of benefits to these weeds. For soil building, yeah, I mean, like, I hate to say it, but albizia, it's a giant tree that makes tons and tons of soil. It's nitrogen fixing. Gunpowder tree makes lots of soil. There's all kinds of things that make soil, but we have many better options that are not invasive, and that's one of the keys. So if you have these things, you can chop and drop those trees and make sure you have them all in logs, no crazy branches all in a big pile, but have it like everything straight if you can. And then you can mulch with that, get all the weeds out, mulch, plant your ground cover even before that, and then you can put the wood down, and then it turns into soil without becoming a big weedy mess.
Perfect. And just emphasizing, let's use our natives before we ever
Yeah.
think about planting invasives for sure.
So you know what? Here's a native one right here. It's a native bean. I don't believe it's edible. It's the non-nea. It's a ground cover / cover crop where you can take cuttings and stick them in the ground, and it's a sprawling vine that's often grown along coastal areas, but that's one that could be used for, overgrowing, low growing weeds. But often whenever you plant in the weeds, what I've found is even the most innocuous weeds become dominant weeds. They just kind of take off. So I'm a fan of getting them all out and then replanting with beneficials.
That is great
Yeah.
advice. The other one that just popped into my mind is actually okuli. It is found on like slope sides, and it will continue to grow, and it's actually a medicinal plant,
Nice.
superfood. So that's something to think about, and you can propagate it just by catching a couple nodes.
Yeah.
So our last question, before we wrap everything up, is do you have a recommendation for controlling sleeping grass, mimosa?
Sleepy grass or sleeping grass. Yes. Also known as hila hila. That's the Olelo Hawai'i term for it. Okay, if you have insomnia, you can use it for helping you sleep. I'm not an herbalist, so this is not medical recommendations or advice, but there are uses for it. It is nitrogen fixing. It has a central tap root in the plant, and then when it runs across the ground, it'll send down additional tap roots if you pin it down, especially. To beat it, I can pull it barehanded. All you got to do is just gently lift up the plant, and then the tap root has no thorns on it. You can just pull it. So if it's not too bad, you can just remove them by hand, get all the root. If there's a lot of it, you could do the weed whacking routine, followed by the black plastic, the woven weed mat. A cardboard sheet mulch is another method. It would need to be laid on like shingles, so multiple layers in each area of cardboard with the plastic removed, covered with mulch on top, should kill the sleepy grass. But other than that, maybe pigs, if they're hungry enough, might go for it, but that's a tough one.
Okay, well, mahalo piha for all of your amazing ike, and it's just been amazing class tonight, and we thank everyone for joining us tonight. The questions have been helping us to get more information out to you folks. And just make sure you fill out that poll before you folks leave. And we want to just mahalo again the USDA for providing the funding for this program. And thank you so much again, Dave, for all of your ike.
Oh yeah, my pleasure. And thank you, darling. Yeah, USDA, HFUU, and everybody for taking the time to check this out. Yeah, well, I hope you can join us for more classes. There'll be a notification coming out. So if you fill out that poll, we'll send notification to you later on. So mahalo, everybody.
Mahalo, thank you so much. Just so enjoyed the class. Mahalo.
Mahalo, so glad you did.
Same here.
All right, mahalo, everybody. Good night.
Mahalo, good night.
Good night.
Hey, thank you, Dave. That was a wonderful presentation.
Truly. I think there is so much to be learned throughout all of that.
Yeah, it was nice to be able to jump in a little bit deeper. A lot of times I do a little bit more of like an overview of a wider variety of practices, but yeah, there's a